So ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, welcome to the second of this distinguished Gifford Lecture Series delivered by our guest, Dr. Cornel West, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And welcome to this magnificent St. Cecilia's Hall as well. My name is Mona Siddiqui, and I'm a professor at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm particularly delighted to be welcoming Professor Cornel West because, well, I'm just going to say it, I nominated him. And we are so pleased that the Gifford Committee, chaired so well by my colleague, Professor J. Brown, accepted the nomination, and years later, here we are. We feel very blessed. Thank you. I've got to go through some tedious housekeeping rules before I'm going to reflect very briefly on one particular point that Professor West raised yesterday. I'm not going to summarize the intellectual content of what he said. I will leave that for the closing remarks that my colleague, Professor Brown, will make. He has that great privilege. But before I do, let me just go through some housekeeping rules. First of all, there's no fire alarm scheduled, so if there is a fire alarm, fire stewards will lead you out in the right direction. We also have first aiders on site in the event that this is required, hopefully not. Toilet facilities are located on the ground floor of the building, and this event, like yesterday's, will be live streamed via YouTube. There is photography as well, and there are cameras here, so if any of you have any concerns, please let me know. Again, as yesterday, Professor West will speak for around 45 minutes. We will have a very short comfort break for about 5 minutes and then come back so we can have more questions, because I felt yesterday we didn't have enough time for questions, and I think there are many of you who want to ask him several things. And he has a restaurant booked in his name, so we need to leave by 7:15. So if you want a question, just hurry and grab him while you can. I think that's all the housekeeping. So before I tell you what today's lecture is going to be about, I just want to reflect on something that Dr. West said yesterday, which made me think again. So David Smith introduced both the Gifford Lectures and Professor West, so I'm not going to repeat this intro. You can Google Dr. West, his life and work, you will see he's pretty active. My brief intro will just reflect on the sense that I feel, and I felt this yesterday, that I'm back in 2017 when Professor Geoffrey Stout gave his Gifford Lectures, and I was honored to give some closing remarks at the joint RSC Gifford seminar. And just as a little plug, there will be another seminar jointly convened by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Gifford Committee on the 15th of May next week in the evening. So please feel free to sign up for that. But in 2017, Professor Stout was joined by his friends for a lively discussion on his lectures, and this included Cornel West. My comments, which can be found online, reflected on the nature of this friendship and this intellectual intimacy. And then yesterday, Cornel West opened his lectures in a very personal way by paying tribute to his friend Geoffrey Stout, which included the phrase, "I would take a bullet for him." The paradox of the violence and deep affection in that saying left me thinking, putting my immediate family to one side, hopefully, would I take a bullet for anyone? And even more unsettling, who, if anyone, would take a bullet for me? The Christian writer Paul Waddell wrote that so much of our life is a history of our friendships. But I wondered about the weight, even the burden of this relationship. When you talk about taking a bullet for someone, you aren't just making the ultimate sacrifice, creating a feeling of extraordinary gratitude, but you're also leaving them with an overwhelming feeling of indebtedness. Perhaps this is a tension in every meaningful relationship. I haven't resolved that yet. In this lecture, Dr. West opens with the inauguration of philosophy in the West. In his responses to Greek catastrophes, including the Peloponnesian Wars, Plato provided profound resources for our own catastrophic moment. To be sure, Plato's fear of disorder and unruly passions and his denigration of history blurred his lens and could blind him to the catastrophic and tragicomic. And yet Plato also understood that when suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, it is generated in the soul, and at once becomes self-sustaining philosophy, then philosophy could become redemptive, and in my conception, jazz-soaked and freestyle. Please join me with a round of applause and welcome Dr. Cornel West on stage. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, what a blessing again. What a blessing. No, my dear Sister Mona, distinguished Professor Siddiqui, we're so very blessed and to know now publicly she is the person responsible for this in many ways with Brother Jay and others. And in fact, I did say that I would take a bullet for my dear Brother Jeff, but I didn't say where. Now, when it comes to Irene B. West and Clifton West, my mama and my daddy is right in the heart. And that's the original use of Kairos in Homer. It's archery. It's right in the center of where the life is. It's in weaving, too. So with Brother Jeff, I'd take one in the stomach, which still might do me in, but as Mama's a little different, you know what I mean? And I say that with a smile because you're absolutely right. The friendship is deep and it cuts very, very, very genuinely. I do want to acknowledge Preston Williams, who was my first teacher, the first black tenured professor of Harvard Divinity School. He's still alive at 97 years old, teaching his class on Reinhold Niebuhr and Martin Luther King Jr. If he's looking, Preston, I love you and you can't do anything about it, too, brother, definitely. Martin Kilson also, I want to acknowledge, the first black tenured professor at Harvard. He's gone now, but his spirit is here forever. I see Brother Xavier and Clifton here, young brothers. I see my brothers here from Florida. Brother Robbie, who's my dear brother, who's wrestling with the death of his father and maybe the death of his mother. I want him to know my prayers are very, very much with him. And I could go on and on to Brandon Terry's, my Morehouse brothers, who I've had a 3-year dialogue with, reading classical and canonical texts of Brother Mark and Paul and Pete and Chuck and Sully and Eddie. It makes a difference, very, very much so. As you recall, for those who were here yesterday, I may have seen it on the technology, that I ended with that poem by Goethe on the diamond. It was the footnote at the end of Max Weber's great essay of January 28th, 1919. Right after 3 major empires have just collapsed, the Russian Empire, Romanov's over, the Russian Revolution sets in. The Austro-Hungarian Empire over, the Ottoman Empire over, catastrophe. Max Weber, the towering public intellectual of that moment in early Europe, which is the very beginnings of the end of the age of Europe as you move to 1945. And Europe is over as a united project, dependent and divided. Soviet Empire on the one side, US Empire on the other. Coming from the jazz tradition, you see, I do not believe that it's possible ever to talk about an isolated voice. Even when Coltrane, in my title, when I talk about Coltrane, as was noted in the question and answer, you see, you can't talk about Coltrane without Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, without Sarah Vaughan, without Carmen McRae and Dinah Washington. And we haven't even got to Billie Holiday yet, or Charlie Parker. So it's always a collective voicing. And it's no accident that same year of 1919, the NAACP, which was founded as a counter-terrorist group, It was founded with the massacre of black people in Springfield, Illinois. Again, what we talked about yesterday, the terror, the trauma, the hatred coming at black people. What will be the moral and spiritual response? What will be the form of political engagement and resistance? But the same year that Max Weber gave his powerful second lecture, it was also 13 days after the killings of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Neinek, throwing those pieces of body, those precious bodies into the river. The Spartacus League repressed. The Spartacus League pushed back. Same year, 1919, NAACP decides to adopt a national anthem for black people. And what is it? Lift every voice, exactly. It's not lift every echo. It's not an echo reflecting a silo. It's a voice, a diamond, something you have to fight for, something you got to struggle for. You can't be a jazz woman. Mary Lou Williams, you're gonna find your voice. Monk tells Train, quit imitating Johnny Hodges of the Duke Ellington Band, continue to find your voice. But Monk, that sounds wrong. Sometimes wrong is right. Sometimes you got to hit some notes that don't fit. You don't want to be well-adjusted to an unjust status quo. You don't want to be well-adjusted to notes behind a bar. Sometimes those bars on the page remind you of bars in the jail. In your mind, in your heart, in your soul, in your structures, in your institutions. So that it lift every voice is both distinctively individual but inescapably collective. So it shuns the narrow forms of rapacious individualism, but it always accents the preciousness of individuality, which flows from rich traditions and networks and families and communities. So when I move to the ancient world, and I move to Plato, and I always move to Plato with a sense of both respect and awe, because there's nobody like Plato, let us be honest. When I move to Plato, I want to move with a group of voices. So when I look on the European side of things, one voice I want to bring with me is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The decolonization setting in, the horror, wrestling with the crimes of Europe and the crimes of the West, but also trying to stay in contact with the best of Europe and the best of the West. But unfortunately, as Chinua Achebe says in his famous essay, not really hearing the voices of the Africans. Okay, that's part of the limitations of our dear Polish brother writing in English, Joseph Conrad. But his voice is still important. Why? Because he's looking at the world through the lens of the catastrophic. That's jazz-like in a certain sense. Crucial. He's got some swing in his borrowed language. You can tell it's not his original language. I've had long discussions with Edward Said about this. I'll be talking about Said in one of the later essays. But Edward Said, of course, is one of the great scholars. As Joseph Conrad wrote his dissertation on Joseph Conrad under the great Harry Levin at Harvard, one of the founders of Complit within the transatlantic world. And Edward would always say, my God, Brother West, Conrad's language just seems to be at times downright barbaric. I said, well, Edward, you should know English is your third language too. You bring what you got. You use what you have. Yes, Conrad will come with us. That's 1899. And then in 1907, we're bringing a young genius who is 25 years old named James Joyce. And he writes the most magnificent short story in the English language called The Dead with Gabriel Conway. Yes, Joyce colonized people. dominated people, subjugated people. Young man, already published chamber music, already a singer. He would be very much at home in this music museum. How it would be beautiful just to be able to play a little James Joyce right now, dealing with the catastrophic, that snow falling faintly and faintly falling at the end as he comes to terms with his Hamlet-like condition of what? Wrestling with the inability to love, a love he's never really experienced, as he sees his wife respond to her former lover, Michael Fury. Crucial, because as we shall see, one of the fascinating things about Socrates, he never cries, he never sheds a tear. No matter how great he is intellectually, no matter how sophisticated he is theoretically and conceptually, anybody who's never shed a tear has never loved anybody. What does that say about blinders at the very pillar of Western civilization? So I want a strong defense of Socrates, but I'm going to look at Socrates as another brother through the lens of a jazz tradition and a blues people. And my tradition begins with tears. It begins with groans and moans and cries. And how do you transfigure it in such a way that somehow you can still be a full-throated voice and force for good in the language of John Coltrane? I want to bring with me another towering figure, 1912, Franz Kafka. Another young man. The Metamorphosis, nothing like it. What is it about Gregor transformed into this monstrous vermin? What is it about Kafka in Central Europe that becomes the laboratory for what will prefigure the decline of Europe? The deep truth-telling of Kafka, almost Dante-esque in its perception of what is to come. And yet still, even as that monstrous vermin, that ungeheuer Gesifa, nasty, dirty, uncanny, peculiar, all of the things that we shall connect with Socrates. Because Socrates is more than anything else a topos. And I want us to remember that. A topos. What does a topos mean? Unclassifiable, unsubsumable. No school of thought, no paradigm, no framework can ever fully grasp his complexity, his depth, his breadth, just like a good jazz musician. But Duke Ellington would say about Ella Fitzgerald, with that beautiful smile of his, he says, she's beyond category. Just herself, not isolated monad, but a wave in an ocean, but a wave so distinctive that there's no conceptual net that could catch her richness. And so it is with Gregor Samsa. But Gregor Samsa is more attuned to music and the playing of the violin of his sister, Greta, than the human beings in that household. Crucial. And also quite different than Conrad, similar to James Joyce. He's full of a love flowing. But Gregor dies full of love, almost self-imposed. We can juxtapose that with Socrates drinking the hemlock when we get to it. Was it just obligation, obedience, or was it kenosis? Now, as a Christian, I have very, very deep biases and prejudices toward kenosis. No doubt about that. Self-emptying, self-surrendering, self-sacrificing, giving it all. I was blessed to travel with a genius named Bootsy Collins. He was a funk master in my own black musical tradition. And I appreciate my brother Jay because he got tickets for me to go see the Average White Band. I mentioned them last night. They're going to be at Usher Hall on Saturday, and his beloved wife Terry worked some magic to get me and my wife tickets so we can see that Scottish funk band, you know what I mean? And as I said before, I know they're not James Brown band, but they sound good. Sound very good. I'll be there rocking with them. Meaning what? Meaning that they also are willing to give of themselves. No pretense. Not staying at the superficial level. Not trying to be locked into narrow forms of responsibility. If you're going to play the funk, you're going to be existentially naked, and you're going to have to master your craft in such a way that you manifest your soul to touch somebody else's soul in order to empower and enable them. And it's not going to be about the music. The music is always a vessel, a conduit to touch other people. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. There's two other quick voices. There's the voice of Thomas Mann of that same year in Death in Venice, of Gustav himself, von Aschenbach, reflecting on the death of Gustav Mahler, towering figure of music, of art, of truth-telling, of creating beauty and the forms of repression in terms of his own gay identity, the mechanisms of denial in terms of trying to come to terms with who he is, but wrestling with what we started with last night, which is beruf, vocation. Gustav is a great artist, a great writer, fundamentally tied to his sense of vocation, just like Socrates' daimon. Practice philosophy, Socrates. Practice philosophy, Socrates. And though we associate Socrates with unbelievable restless questioning and interrogation and scrutiny, he's very obedient. It's crucial. And I know a lot of my scholars in analytic philosophy, they don't like to talk about Socrates being obedient to divine voices. Brother West, where are you getting that from? It's in the text. It's in the text. I'm reading as a jazz man. I'm reading as a blues man. Yes, it is. And when he feels as if he no longer hears that voice, and it says in the jail cells, I'll read in a minute, practice the arts, practice music. And he says, my God, I got it wrong maybe? I've been out here in the public sphere interrogating these folk to examine their assumptions and presuppositions, and maybe I should have been writing some songs. Well, Socrates, we don't know. We'll never know. But is that kind of ambiguity and ambivalence built in? And the beautiful thing about ambiguity and ambivalence is what? It always reinforces what is, for me, the benchmark of spiritual maturity, which is humility. And you can connect that humility with a militant tenacity. You can still take a stand with courage. Indeed. If hearing today, it looked like there's going to be an invasion of Rafah, huh? My God, my God. People taking a stand around the world. We hope not in the spirit of self-righteousness, but in the spirit of emptying themselves in order to let folk know that we care about you, so that the kenosis has something to do with the flow of love and the compassion, like the end of Gregor Samsa's life. The last voice I'm bringing is that of Virginia Woolf, 1917. The mark on the wall. The mark on the wall. And the unbelievable possibilities of interpretations of that mark. One little small mark on the wall creates disruption in terms of how one understands one's everyday life, the routines that one undergoes, the forms of chronos that one enacts. And though it turns out to be a snail, there's a whole host of other possibilities. It could be the patriarchal world with its monotones imposing its narrow dogmas on the majority of humankind. It could be ruling classes trying to convince subaltern classes, workers, colonized people, marginalized people, that somehow they have less power and not worthy of access to resources and ought to remain silent and not follow the anthem of black people, which is to lift every voice. And one of the great contributions of the jazz tradition is to democratize a topos and democratize the voice so that each and every person is in some sense beyond category, in some way, unsubsumable, in some way. Now again, my Christian prejudices are there because it's a dignity and a sanctity made in the image and likeness of an almighty God, and therefore that dignity and sanctity is non-negotiable, no matter what color or gender, no matter what class or national or religious or non-religious identity. There's something about their status, something about the degree to which they are members of a sentient creaturehood, as well as those with a language. Now, of course, the Peter Singers and others come along and introduce the dogs and the cats and the animals and so forth, and I try to be jazz-like and open-minded about these things. But there's got to be a critical filter, too, you know what I mean? By the time you get to Gregor and cockroaches and vermin and so forth, I'm not sure that I would show up for an encampment for the vermin. But I'm showing up for encampment for my very, very precious and priceless Palestinian brothers and sisters, as I would for any group undergoing that, be they Armenians, be they Jews, any group. It could be Armenians, it could be Jews, it could be Ethiopians, across the board. But let's turn now to the text. Let's turn to 607b5. That is the scene of instruction of the emergence of philosophical discourse in the history of the West. I know you don't have your text with you, so I'll read for you. He said, this is from the old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Well, 10 lines before, he says, Homer is the most poetic of poets and the first of tragedians, but we must know the truth that we can admit no poetry in our city, save only hymns to the gods and the praises of good men. So, of course, anybody tells us that Plato eliminated all the poets, it's clear they haven't read the text. Plato always has a space for those who have encomium to great people and those who have hymns to the god. His critique is of mimetic poetry that acts as if it can make truth claims when it's 3 degrees away from truth-telling. And therefore, it can only remain at the superficial level of surfaces, given Plato's epistemology. We're not going to go into all the details here. The crucial thing is that for Plato, and this is so important, that the quarrel between philosophy and poetry, and I include music on the poetic side, is a fight over paideia. It's a fight over forms of education. Rousseau says Republic is the finest treatise ever written on education. I know my dear brother David is a professor of education. I remind my professors of education that in so many ways what's at stake for any serious reflection on education is not just vocation and calling, but invocation tied to vocation. And invocation is the remembrance of what has gone into your sense of your vocation. Just like Calling is tied to recalling. There's no sense of what your calling is unless it has been viewed against earlier callings. When you find your voice, it's bouncing off against other voices. And probably the clearest conception of this is in our dear brother Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American scholar. We don't have time to get into that right now, Brother Jeff, but Jeff has written with great power. But let me read on. He said, but if you grant admission to the honeyed muse in lyric or epic, pleasure or pain will be the lords of your city instead of law, and which shall from time to time have approved itself to the general reason of the best. We ourselves are very conscious of the spell of these poets and musicians. But all the same, it would be impious to betray that we believe to be the truth. Is not that so, friend? Do not let yourself feel the magic of the poets and the musicians. Now, this massive but not exclusive exclusion of the poets is one of the greatest tributes to the power of poetry and the power of music, that anything that constitutes such a threat, given Plato's own commitment to his hierarchical chain of being, his tripartite conception of the soul, his tripartite conception of society, that is profoundly authoritarian, profoundly anti-democratic. But the paradox is that he's writing in such a thoroughly democratic genre and form. All of that Socratic energy being unleashed. All of the claims about accountability and answerability and critique being unleashed. The conversation going on and on. How paradoxical. And probably Alfred North Whitehead understood this better than most, not so much in his grand Gifford Lectures, The Process and Reality, but in a classic that I would hope that all of the young folk and even some of the older folk would want to read and reread, which is Adventures in Ideas, the classic of 1933. It begins with the noble discontent, the critical discontent of the Platonic dialogues that unleashes this discontent so that Plato himself provides oftentimes the very critique of his own positions. That's what it is to have a jazz-like genre, a democratic genre, polyphonic all the way down, even though he's reaching his own Platonisms too often. And of course, as we shall see, the Republic is a very different text than the Laws. Same Plato. In the Laws, no Socrates, no reference to philosophy at all. And in fact, the Laws ends, I don't have a whole lot of time here, with an adoption of the theatrical and dramatic model of a society that's allowing for the flowering and flourishing. And in fact, he says quite explicitly, maybe I should just read this to you because I don't want you to think I'm saying things just out that's not based in the text here. This is quite fascinating what he has to say. He actually ends up saying here, here it is, 1375, let me get it for you here. Here he says, we shall pass our lives in playing of games, especially those games of sacrifice, song, and dance. This is Plato at the end of his life. And the result of the ability to gain heaven's grace and to repel and vanquish any enemy that we have to fight. What sort of song and dance would effect both results has probably been stated already. But the path has been cut for us in assurance that the poet was right when he said, search for some thoughts, thy own suggesting mine, and others dictated by heavenly power shall rise spontaneous in the needful hour, for not unprosperous shall thy ways attend, born with good omens and with heaven thy friend. And that's a quote from Homer, from the Odyssey. Plato, subject to all of that internal struggle, just like us, never fully consistent or coherent, shot through with unbelievable incongruities, inconsistencies. Consistency is a hobgoblin of Little mind, says Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yes, indeed, indeed, indeed. If we turn then to the very beginning of the Republic, we see this even more clearly. And let's keep in mind, Emerson himself called Socrates the Aesop of the mob. It's a fascinating thing. The sweetest saint up to that time, because he's still got elapsed Protestantism working, so he hasn't got to Jesus yet. But the sweetest saint up to this time, the Aesop of the mob. Emerson says in his famous essay, Plato or the Philosopher, you see. But the way Plato begins his text, and I think the way in which any serious metaphilosophy ought to begin the text, is poetic, musical, all the way down. Let me just add a brief digression here, because as many of you know, in the last 60 years, there's been a kind of frenzy of metaphilosophy. Maybe even going further back. There was a time in which, when Brother Jeff and I were coming along, if you didn't have a conception of metaphilosophy, then you weren't worthy of anybody listening to you. We had been deeply shaped by Richard Rorty. We love Richard Rorty very much, but he was a metaphilosopher at his best. But what he attempted to do, he was trying to demythologize, just like Marx was trying to demystify, just like Derrida was trying to deconstruct. So everybody had to have a conception of philosophy before they actually got into doing philosophy. So they had a sense of, well, okay, well, what does the violin sound like? Well, no, play the darn thing and see. We don't need a metaphilosophy. Jump into the mess. Beckett's language. And I'm sitting here looking at an international treasure in Brother Owen Dudley Edwards. Give it up for this brother. Give it up for this brother right here. Oh, what a spirit. What a personality. What a human being. We had a wonderful conversation yesterday. But what does it mean to jump into the middle of it? Beckett would call the mess what we're calling the funk from the black musical tradition. That's where the love is. That's where the freedom is. That's where the pain, the suffering, the blood, the stink, the stench is. And somehow you work it through. Yes. Heidegger, towering philosophic genius. Nazi for 18 months. What a gangster. How do you fuse genius with gangster? It's human, all too human. I was just reading Pippin's latest book on the culmination, that last chapter in the poetic thinking of Heidegger, ending philosophy, and it's now all poetry, and he dives into hurtling. And yet there's a line in hurtling that he never really comes to terms with, where hurtling says, he or she who thinks most deeply loves most vigorously and deeply. Heidegger thinks deeply. The love is not forthcoming. So all of those words, all of those pages, all of those texts, full of profound insight. But where's the kenosis? The body, the mind, the heart, the soul, the memory, the remembrance, the reverence, the resistance, the resilience. Where is it, Martin? Paul Celan had a word for him, didn't he? He's the greatest poet of post-World War II Europe, our Jewish brother. Speak yes, speak no. Death fugue. I can't take it. I can't bear the weight anymore. Where is your compassion, Martin? And of course, his suicide in so many ways. What a challenge to us. With Rabbi Heschel's text, the Sabbath, on the table next to his bed. You say, what a challenge to us. Same would be true with John Dewey in his lectures here of 1929, The Quest for Certainty. Metaphilosophy, magnificent, powerful in so many ways. As we mentioned yesterday, Dewey Where's the catastrophe? Where's the swing? The improvisation is there, but it's still a little stilted. So the insight's strong, but important. And Rorty comes along and says, I want to resurrect Dewey. Well, are you sure you got Dewey right? Or which Dewey will come forth? Will it be the Dewey who calls for an end to philosophy? Will it be a Dewey who wants to reconstruct philosophy? Get it right, Brother Rorty, we love you. But creative misreadings have their limits. He still provides a very, very important function. I always love my brother. But at the same time, in our moment of overwhelming catastrophe, is that what is required to fortify ourselves? Jacques Derrida dancing on the grave of Heidegger with deconstructionist moves. Are you not still a parasite on a host? Heidegger was talking about destruction. You're talking about deconstruction. Deconstruction is a species of skepticism. David Hume's skepticism was more austere and rigorous than yours, Jacques Derrida. Remember that book 1, part 4, section 7 of that treatise of human nature that he wrote at 25 years old here in Edinburgh? That philosophical melancholy and delirium that he has to come to terms with, given that rigorous skepticism, and then the sense of the comic. I can't deal with it. Reason is not strong enough. I dine, I converse, I play backgammon. And I spend some hours with my friends in order to come to terms with that melancholy and delirium. David Hume, we appreciate the honesty. We appreciate the candor. Yes. Plato says, no compartmentalization here. The epistemic is not going to be fetishized. The existential and the economic go together. The personal and the political go together. The social and the spiritual go together. I have a synoptic vision, a synecdochic imagination. And by synecdochic, I mean synecdoche, the relation of parts and parts, relation of parts and wholes, and the ways in which a whole is always more than just the sum of the parts. And even a synthetic analysis coming out of certain scriptures on the way to Hegel. I thank God for James Sterling, who gave the first Gifford Lecture. He was the grand pioneer to introduce the English-speaking world to Hegel. He got in a lot of trouble. I think, as I recall, the subject of his book is The Secret Hegel. James, can you be a little bit more explicit? What about the Hegel who everybody needs? Well, we're going to talk about this when we get to T.S. Eliot and F.H. Bradley, and the dissertation he writes on F.H. Bradley, who flows out of Sterling's introduction of Hegel in the English-speaking world, where the whole is the truth. The whole is the truth. When Adorno says the whole is the false, it's a way of affirming Hegel in a negative way, negative dialectics. Heuristically, you posit the whole, it's always false, but you look at the world through the lens of the whole. That's the only possibility of a redemptive view for someone like Adorno. And then last but not least, there's the underrated Alfred North Whitehead's Metaphilosophy. He gave a wonderful lecture on his retirement to the graduate students at Harvard and Radcliffe in 1935 called The Aims of Philosophy. And he said philosophy and poetry are so intertwined, you can't even begin to separate them. He had already said the exact is always fake. And he said it with authority because he's one of the greatest mathematicians of his day, writing Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell, volumes 1 and 2. But the exact is always fake when it comes to wrestling with what it means to be human. It's always too narrow, always too homogeneous, always too empty, always too vacuous. And he says, As much as I wrestle with Plato, I've reached the conclusion that I need both. I need math, philosophy going to school with mathematics and science. He was also a physicist. And philosophy going to school with the poets and the musicians. Whitehead, very important, overlooked figure, even given his, what would be a kind word for Alfred? Uncompelling metaphysics. Let me just put it that way. Let me just be as kind as I can be here in the museum. But let's start with this struggle. And it's very important. I mean, one of the great readings of Plato comes from Eric Voegelin's text. And Eric Voegelin argues that what Plato did was to actually enact a fascinating form of sophisticated argumentation within the form of dramatic prose with poetic dimensions. So Plato's praxis already is a certain kind of answer. His praxis is already a certain kind of non-propositional response to his question. Because he's the most poetic of philosophers, even though he's got profound suspicion of poetry, precisely because, as we noted before, he has such an appreciation of it. And there's stories of Plato, of course, walking around with his tragedies, trying to imitate Sophocles, until he runs into Socrates. And he burns him. Just like Kafka asking Max Brod, burn all my work. Max says, I'm your best friend, but I'm a wise man. I think the world needs to hear you, even after you're dead at 40. Yes. Plato, Cataben, I went down yesterday to the Piraeus, already shot through references to Odysseus going down to Hades with myself and my friends. The sense of wrestling with what we were talking about yesterday. Death, dogma, domination as he understands it. The deep catastrophes, the wars acknowledged, plagues as well. But for Plato, one of the grandest catastrophes is what? The death of his mentor, the death of his master. And his fundamental vocation is to make the world safe for Socrates. Just like for me on a much different and lower level, that so much of what I've done in the last 55 years is try to make the world safe for what went into the West household of pouring into me as a little black child unbelievable levels of love and integrity and courage, and then being open enough to learn voices from others, intellectually, theoretically, so that to be a wave in an ocean that would then take me back to Martin King and take me back to Fannie Lou Hamer and take me back to Curtis Mayfield and take me back to Nina Simone and take me back to John Coltrane and take me back to a whole host of others that are part of that flow, so that the ROOTS, the deep roots from whence I come, the best, critical of the worst, open me to the ROUTES, the routes to have conversations with philosophic figures from around the world of all colors and cultures and civilizations and empires. To do what? To be just a brief creature in space and time by means of seeing and feeling and acting, grounded in lens, broader lens, to view the world. Deeper feelings with swing and groove and polyrhythms, and then, most importantly, the proof in the pudding, the actions, the deeds, the praxis. What Plato introduces at this very, very early age, it took him 19 years to write this text, the founding text. saying, let us begin by going down. Almost like Heraclitus, the way up is going to be the way down. T.S. Eliot's going to use that as one of his epigraphs. The way up and the way down are the same. We're going to begin with death. We're going to begin, as we noted yesterday, not with abstract conceptions of death, but people who are on the edge. Speaking to the younger generation, Glaucon, brother of Plato, Cephalus, about to die. That's the first substantive conversation. Yes, indeed. I went down yesterday to Piraeus with Glaucon, the son of Ariston. Ariston is the father of Plato himself, to pay my devotions to the goddess, because I wished to see how they would conduct the festival. What festival is that? The festival of Bindus, tied to who? Oh, those foreigners, Thracians. What was Piraeus? The site of commerce. People from all around the Middle East and Northern Africa came together. They would call it today multicultural. I don't like that phrase. Just like I can't stand diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, that's not nothing I die for. I like truth, justice, and love. That's what I died for. But the very fact that because the Greeks were so tied to Greeks versus barbarians, you're forced to interact with people from a variety of different cultures and ways of life. That's where Socrates is going. That will set the tone for the emergence of philosophy as a distinctive, relatively autonomous mode of discourse, but also tied to a way of life, even though they will become more and more estranged over time. And by the time you get to the modern world, philosophy has become almost thoroughly professionalized, corporatized in so many ways, with its own jargon, its own language, hard to generate vocabularies and languages that ordinary people can learn and listen. As the professions create their own hierarchies and ways of generating forms of approval. No, not with Plato. He still got that poetic element there. And let us not forget the fact that he's also building on the mimes of Sophron. And the mimes of Sophron are very important because they were these forms of entertainment for everyday people, for poor people and working people. It was already resistant to the hierarchy of styles where the tragedy was confined only to the well-to-do and comedy was confined to the lower classes. So you get Plato again mixing these styles in his form and genre, even as he's justifying profoundly anti-democratic structures and institutions. I come back to that paradox over and over again. But this starting point that would generate this major, major break with Homer. How do I dislodge Homer? I'm writing at a time in which I do not yet know. I will end up saying some positive things about him. The fight over paideia. What is paideia from the vantage point of a blues people? The formation of attention. Simone Weil and others make so much of this in their own distinctive ways. The formation of attention. How do we cultivate attending to things that matter, of life and death and joy and sorrow, of grief, of anger, in the face of overwhelming organized greed and institutionalized hatred? How do we engage in the shift, that periagoge, the turning of the soul that sits at the very center of this great treatise on education? For Plato, it's the shift from appearance to reality. It's the shift from coming to being. It's the shift from opinion to knowledge. Yes, but it is a shift. Christians will later on call it metanoia or conversion, but it's a shift. It's an attempt to wake people up from that cave that sits at the very center of this text, from the shadows, to gain access to something grander, ideals of agathon, whatever you want to call it, kingdom of God, ideals of democracy, ideals of equality, something better, that's something more that the great William James talked about here in the varieties of religious experience. Something more than those dominant tendencies of our wretched history as a species that we are. That's what is at stake. The formation of attention. How do we cultivate the capacity for people to think critically for themselves, to recognize themselves as distinctive atopos, unique, irreproducible, irrepeatable, of great value and dignity, an ability to cultivate whatever gifts they have. That formation of attention goes hand in hand with this cultivation of a critical acuity, a critical consciousness, as it were. And then last but not least, in some ways we end where Weber ended. I had Weber in yesterday with maturity. The maturity. Echoes in some way of Consuela's enlightenment. Let me see. The maturity means what? The courage to call into question your self-imposed immaturity. The courage to call into question all of the various things that stand in the way of you being able to reach the highest level, your best self, in connection to a best tradition and the best of a community, or a church, or a mosque, or a synagogue, or a temple, or a nightclub, or Usher Hall. Yes, we can find the best of human beings in a variety of different forms, but that has everything to do with paideia, deep education, qualitatively different than cheap schooling. That deep education has everything to do with issues of courage. And it is no accident that when Plato raises the question of what is courage in his dialogue, The Lackeys, it's the only time he uses the phrase musical life. He says the courageous person who tries to act in such a way that it's in harmony with who one fundamentally is the truest musician. That's what he says in the Lackeys. Courage, and we know courage is the enabling virtue for all the other virtues. All the other virtues are just lip service, sounding brass and tinkling cymbal, empty, vacuous, without courage. And we're going to see as we move and march down through the quarters of time in these lectures, that one of the reasons why we're living in moments of overwhelming spiritual decay and moral decadence, of organized greed and institutionalized hatred, is that we just have too many cowardly folk, especially in high places. But especially in middle places, especially in places where people are struggling every day, especially in the dark corners of our own souls. Conformity, complacency, cowardliness. And yes, it's true, as Thomas More raises a question in the Tower of London, right before he's executed, writing those beautiful letters to his daughter Margaret. The tribulation, wrestling with the comfort. Why is it that Socrates never cries and Jesus never laughs? Does that in some way disenable us, make us less fortified, less able to be courageous? And you could spend 2 lifetimes answering that question, but it's one worth wrestling with. And that's why when we turn next week to my dear brother Erasmus, praise of folly, history of fools, history of folly, history of fantasia, connected to generating more courageous persons. And of course, with Erasmus, we'll be moving. We jump so far, of course, but we'll be moving toward the greatest public intellectual in the history of Europe. There's been nobody like him. The only one that comes close is a Scotsman called George Buchanan, who has been so thoroughly overlooked, he's hardly even part of the discourse anymore. If I had time, I'd bring him back. Because if you ask Erasmus about George Buchanan, it's almost like asking Oscar Peterson about Art Tatum. Silence. Let him come in, I bow. But they are voices, figures in a great tradition, full of unbelievable limitations, full of unbelievable shortcomings, but still persons from whom we can learn if we take seriously a jazz people's tradition and a blues people's effort to wrestle with the catastrophic in such a way that we provide some sense of hope and possibility. Thank you all so very much. We'll have Thanks, guys. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, no, indeed, indeed.
So we're going to have a 5 minutes, literally a 5-minute break. If you could be back out of respect for the speaker at 25:02. The toilets are on the ground floor, and then we'll resume with questions. And there will be questions online as well, so a 5-minute break for in-person and online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have around 20 minutes and there are roving mics. So please do raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and please keep the question brief. Anyone? Any questions? Please, there's a gentleman. Oh, did you have your hand up? Sorry. No, go ahead, and then the gentleman there.
So, I mean, you mentioned the complexity of Plato and that in a way he sometimes contradicts himself and so on. Do you think that this is this complexity and maybe irony that Karl Popper has missed in his criticism?
Oh, in Open Society, Volume 1. Karl Popper, that's a powerful text. Of course, he wrote that at a time in which, as an anti-fascist, he had to lay bare some of the elective affinities and similarities between the infanticide and the arranged marriages, and we can go on and on. That's at work in this text. But no, Karl Popper had his own distinctive kind of talent that was bereft of a sensitivity to subtle readings of metaphor and metonymy and rhetoric. Is that a fair characterization of Karl, you think?
I'm glad that you confirm my
No. Well, we both could be wrong, too, but, but I think I'm right, and I think you're right. No, it's true. It's true.
The gentleman up there. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the amazing lecture again. I want to ask you about your philosophical development. It might have been a better question, sir, for yesterday or the last day, but here's my chance. So going back 50 years to your essay on philosophy in the African-American experience, I believe it was called, talking about Heidegger and Wittgenstein and Dewey, and then moving to what you call the prophetic pragmatism, where you're really bringing in a lot of American philosophers and others, and now here we are talking about a jazz-soaked philosophy. I'm just wondering if there's any breaks going on, or if kind of the last 50 years can kind of be like subsumed under this jazz-soaked philosophy, especially like the prophetic pragmatism. It's just kind of all within that jazz-soaked philosophy.
Yes, no, I appreciate that question. This dear brother came all the way from the United States. Which part of the state? Wisconsin. And your name again is? Colin. Brother Colin, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that essay was written in 1977. So that would be, what, about 47 years ago? So I've had to make sure that I can even recognize the brother who wrote that essay. You get my age, it's hard to keep track from week to week, and I'm not talking about fleeting self-identities the way Hume is because of his associationist model. I'm talking about some real collapses of memory here. But it's certainly a stage. It's certainly a stage in where I was. I had given a paper actually in '73 at Tuskegee, and it was called Black Music as a Source of Black Philosophical Reflection. You see what I mean? So that you can see there's kind of simultaneous developments in no way coherent and consistent from context to context. And so there is a certain kind of trajectory over time that takes it back to black music, because I'm just being true to myself in terms of what black musical traditions meant to me. And then the ways in which it allows me to resonate with so many other figures, be they musical or not. I mean, somebody like Kafka, you know, he didn't like music at all. He couldn't stand noise. He couldn't stand the instruments being played. And yet, in his short story, he's got a sensitivity to music and musicality that's rare among folk who are actually musicians. I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre played a beautiful piano. You don't go to his text for musicality. Sartre, keep that to yourself and play the piano in another context. So you can see how complicated these things are, really. But I love the question, I do. And I haven't thought about my own development too much, really. I'm just trying to live as intensely as I can, moment to moment. But I appreciate the question.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back. On that row. And then the gentleman in the pink shirt.
Thank you very much. So my question is about courage, but another type of courage, the capitalistic courage, the courage of the entrepreneur. Takeover of the idea of courage. And then there is another courage, the courage of Christopher Columbus, the colonial courage. And how do we set the boundaries around this courage with these other takeovers of courage? And then linked to music, these other types of courage also come with their types of music, right? So the type of music that was used during, for example, the American invasion of Vietnam, the courage of the soldiers, and with Wagner's opera, or the Iranian military police using certain types of religious music to get the courage going and repress people. So essentially, I think it's important to talk about courage, but also talk about all of these takeovers of courage and nuance. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, it's a beautiful question, my brother. Beautiful question. And to have you and your magnificent companion, my dear Iranian brothers and sisters in the house, makes a big difference. With my Iranian wife, as you know, you all had an immediate solidarity there. That was fascinating yesterday, and I appreciated it. But no, it's very interesting. For example, when Plato bans the flute in the Republic, but he preserves the lyre, you see, because the flute appeals to too many sides of the soul that don't fit within the tripartite hierarchy that he has. And even though we're told, it may be false, that at the end of his life, he had a flute under his pillow. And he asked the Thracian girl to play the flute as he passed. And he was doing like this to keep time. Now, it could be false, but it sounds so good. Because of the contradictions and the incongruities, you see what I mean? That we know he had a profound appreciation of the flute. That's another reason why he had to push it aside. But so it is with any term, any tradition, any vocabulary, any word and jargon, you see. That courage can be hijacked, colonized, abused like any other. That's part of the undeniable human creativity for evil. Just can use anything. You can use democracy, you can use equality, you can use love, you can use courage, and so forth and so on. But you're absolutely right about when we talk about entrepreneurs, you know, there's a difference, I think, between risk And here we had to get Aristotelian and almost go back to Thomas Aquinas and try to have some subtle distinctions between, for example, courage and fearlessness, not the same thing for Aristotle. Because courage has to work through fear. You eliminate fear, you're in deep trouble, because fear has a function as an instinct for we organisms transacting with environment and so forth, right? And the same would be true in terms of courage is going to be different, I think, than risk. I tend to think of entrepreneurial activity as taking a risk, but I wouldn't call that courage in that regard. And the same would be true for, military bands marching to try to subjugate. I think of precious Jewish brothers and sisters in the indescribable concentration camps. The great Arthur Miller, who was my dear brother, one of the towering playwrights of the 20th century. I just spent much time with Arthur. He wrote this wonderful play about Jewish brothers and sisters playing beautiful music right before the encroachment of the deaths imposed on them. That's courage. It's like the Warsaw Ghetto of 43. That's courage. Forms of resistance around the world. Courage. But then the difference for me, courage tied to moral and spiritual dimensions. You see, so you have to make sure you got the end and the means. We were talking about this with Brother Jeff today, right? The just ends and the just means. That's very important. Very important. So courage has to be tied to some kind of moral and spiritual cause that's defensible. And so you're absolutely right. It's one in many. It's one in many. Very much so.
Thank you. The gentleman with the pink
You had a question in the back of
Sorry,
there,
just,
brother?
him, and then,
yeah, all right.
And then we'll go to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. You've spoken about education, cowardice, and praxis, and favoring true justice and love over things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. This university has an incoming curriculum transformation program that seeks to embed things like DEI into curriculum design. I wondered if you could speak to, and I've been trying to engage with senior management and the people who are putting it together to try and engage in this dialogue. I wonder if you could speak to your recommendation for alternative praxis that this institution could take to avoid the application of divisive ideologies or all praxis that could make things worse rather than making things better.
Yes, no, I appreciate that though, brother. I already salute the work that you're doing. I mean, I am a critical defender of DEI. I just recognize it's the best that one can get from corporatized universities that are oftentimes tied much less to truth and justice, but rather reproducing themselves and making sure they have access to the donors and benefactors. And this is in the United States. I don't know the dynamics here in Scotland, but my hunch is there's some similarities, but I don't know. Well, you'd have to inform me, instruct me in that regard. So that even though I am highly critical of DEI, because that's not where I want to end up, you see, it is the deodorized, sanitized language of the bureaucracy and administrators who don't want to talk about truth and justice and say, well, let's just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, but no. Any institution that's involved in Socratic dialogue and says we have no interest in truth, we just want diversity, you're in trouble already. You're in trouble already. And because we have such a great tradition of talking about truth and justice and love, not just around the world, but especially among subaltern, insurgent, counter-hegemonic traditions and peoples, that's the tradition I want to be a part of. You see what I mean? That's the one. Jesus dying for diversity? No. No. That's a situation where the blood at the cross that changes a life becomes Kool-Aid at the bottom of the cross that helps you gain access to your next commodity. That's transactional. The other one's transformational. I don't want to get too Christian and theological in here. I know we've got an ecumenical crowd. But you see my point. There's nothing wrong with truth, beauty, goodness, God being talked about critically, self-critically, tied to great traditions as we undergo and move maybe in a dark tunnel from which we will not emerge, given the kinds of catastrophes that we're wrestling with. So we have to be very explicit, honest, candid of what we're talking about. And bureaucratic language is not going to do it, at least not for me. And I've never used bureaucratic language. I've been invited to talks all around the United States. And they start off with DEI. I said, I'm not a DEI kind of brother. Ever. It's truth, justice, love. Oh, that's played out. There's no such thing as truth. How come? I read Nietzsche. Read him again. Read him again. You know, read some Lou Salome when he's down on his knees asking to marry her. Friedrich, does something strike you as true? When she says no to you and you break down and cry like a baby. Oh, Brother West, you're so unfair to me. No, I'm giving you a hug, man. You talking about something true. Give up your talk about just this envy and resentment. No, you got a lot of envy and resentment in him. That's truthful, that he has to come to terms with. Are you willing to be truthful about your trashing of truth? That's another way of raising the question. I don't want to go on and on with Nietzsche. I love Nietzsche. He's meant the world to me. But he's just wrong about a whole lot of things. And being a lapsed Lutheran, I know how to get at him. No, it's true. I mean, John Powers Cooper used to say that Nietzsche was an intellectual sadist because he would attack viciously the very things that meant so much to him. He would say, have the courage not only to fight for your convictions, but attack your own convictions. That's why he's holding that mule when the mule is attacked right before he collapses. That sounds very Christian to me, protecting the vulnerable. Nietzsche, I thought you were on the side of the strong and the powerful. Well, I am in my text, but this mule means much to me. I'm in solidarity with you. I'm going on too long, and I'm maybe a bit unfair, but you see the point I'm trying to make, my brother. Absolutely.
Final question.
But we had a question in the back of our dear brother with that wonderful hat. He's got that beautiful hat there.
Brilliant. Thank you for a great lecture. And you've just mentioned Nietzsche, of course. But one signal omissions, maybe it's deliberate, it's not clear, Schopenhauer, who said that music is the most immediate expression of the noumenal self. Nietzsche and Kant straddle Schopenhauer. To your mind, does Schopenhauer answer Kant's question about the noumenon?
How a powerful question, my dear brother. Let me first say that Schopenhauer, for me, is one of the fundamental brooks of fire through which we must pass, not just in discourses about music, but as philosophy as a whole. That he's the one who's going to make this major break from the obsession with reason and logos and rationality and tie it to will and volition. And he's building in some ways on the Schelling's great essay of 1809, the essay on the essence of human freedom after the death of his wife, the catastrophe. So that Schopenhauer in 1818, a young man in his 20s, just like David Hume, writes his magisterial text, both volumes, crucial, fundamental in his claims about music. He's still in a Kantian framework. I'm not in a Kantian framework, and therefore the phenomenal and the noumenal don't mean as much to me as it does for him. But it's his way of trying to get at something that is twofold. Because you remember in Arthur Schopenhauer's work that for him, it's black people and dogs who become litmus tests of how people treat other people and become, in so many ways, the, what would be the best example of it? It's a measure of their moral character as persons and a society. How you treat black people, how you treat dogs. His closest companion, as you know, of all time was who? His dog. Go on and listen to Rossini every night, going back to see his dog. You see. Deep I thou, to use the language of Martin Buber here, deep I thou relations. So the centrality of music, he means much. Phenomenal, noumenal, well, that's the content framework that I'm holding at arm's length, because what I'm fundamentally saying is music is one of the ways in which we wrestle with what it means to be human, given the overwhelming wounds and scars and bruises that we experience, and try to, again, transfigure them in such a way that by sound, acoustic relation, we might be able to preserve the best of what comes before. Now, the other interlocutor for Schopenhauer is who? Plato. It's Plato and Kant. Those are the two fundamental pillars. And it would be fascinating if he, for example, had not spent so much of his subsequent life rewriting his earlier text, because he spends most of his life rewriting that text that he wrote in his 20s. If we had a close reading of Schopenhauer on some of the passages of Plato sustained, it would be extraordinary. It would be almost like listening to the hymn that Socrates wrote, or reading the versified fables of Aesop that he wrote in prison. See, it'd be fascinating. Now, Diogenes Laertius actually has a quote. This is what Socrates wrote. And Socrates, you can imagine, Diogenes is very imaginative, brother. And it's I won't go into it now, but I mean, it's fascinating just to get a sense of it. For me, I've always viewed Nietzsche, the early Nietzsche, as a very rich footnote to Schopenhauer. And then, as you know, in the later years, the critique of Schopenhauer. And it's something that you and I just need to talk about for hours and hours and hours and hours. But I appreciate your question, though, brother, very much so.
Just honestly, you have like 10 seconds to answer whatever question is going to be asked.
That's right. That's
but
fine. That's
just
fine.
Very quick question.
Absolutely.
I'll make it quite quick. So, talking about musical lives, to what extent is Socrates' death cruciform, and to what extent is Jesus' life Socratic? Just a quick question.
So that Socrates' death being what?
Cruciform.
Oh, cruciform.
Yeah.
Oh,
You have
yes.
10 seconds, remember.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on how we use these words, though. Your cruciform usually has a redemptive possibility that goes beyond simply the historical horizon. You remember Socrates himself says, you all think I'm on trial, but it's really Athens who is on trial. And people will look back on this moment and make their own decisions and judgment. Well, see, that's a certain kind of quasi-cruciform sense, but it doesn't have the kind of larger theological richness that cruciform does in my own language. And Jesus dying, being Socratic, oh no. There's Socratic elements, yes, because he's questioning, because he's interrogating, he's scrutinizing. What is truth? Pontius Pilate. Roman Empire, power, conquest, their conception of greatness, Alexander, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, or Attila. That's what greatness is, conquering, power. Jesus said, I got a different conception of greatness, qualitatively different conception of greatness. Does Socrates ever understand that conception of greatness? I don't think so. But I'm always open for folk to put forward arguments that I will probably find unconvincing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just looking around the room and looking at my divinity colleagues, rethinking, did Jesus die for diversity? But that will be in the next ref submission. Yes. I want to thank you not only for the lecture, but for your very gracious responses. Thank you to the audience. Hope to see many of you on Thursday for the 3rd Gifford Lecture. And once again, a reminder that the RSE Gifford seminar will be on May the 15th. Please do engage with the Gifford blog. Yes, thank you for coming. And again, once again, a round of applause for Dr. West.